Oi, oi. All right. So now with the surprise release of Magic 2, now that we have 5 albums from Nas's collaboration with Hit Boy, it seems like a good time to look back, reflect on the records we've gotten and put them in some kind of ranking. I've always been a big fan of Nas's work, but still haven't gotten through all of his records. I think he's done like 14 now. So I can't yet expand this ranking to his whole body of work, but this seems like a good start. The format I'm using for this is simply just ranking from worst to best or least favorite to favorite, which is 5 records, so 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, rather than the tier list. And the reason for that is because this is just like a really consistent crop of records. So it's going to make a tier approach like a little bit boring. They're all probably going to be ranked somewhat similar. And in a world where Nas actually delivered Illmatic, like the ultimate S-tier hip-hop album, it's kind of difficult to factor that in. So we're just going to go from least to most favourite, and we're going to start that at number 5 with Magic. This was a complete surprise when this dropped Christmas Eve in 2021. I definitely thought that after the home run of that year's King's Disease 2, we might have to wait a while for the next Nas record. But sure enough, before the end of that year, we had another 9 tracks to chew on, plus the confirmation, I think, in that track Ugly, that King's Disease 3 was at that time on the way. As mentioned, all 5 of the records in this series are great, so by putting this 5th, I'm in no way saying it's bad. It's just the one I found I've gone back to the least. Meet Joe Black, though, is actually one of my favourite tracks from the 5 albums, with an effortlessly great rapped chorus from our king here. But there are also some fumbles in the track list. Wave Gods, a track reuniting Nas with DJ Premier and also featuring A$AP Rocky, should be a classic, but for some reason it's just a little bit mid. It's fun, but not as special as it has every right to be. Next to that, we have just solid tracks that most artists would kill to have in their discography, but next to the other 4 records in this series, this is just like the starting line for Nas. So I'm going to go ahead and put that in 5, but in 4th, I'm going to have to put King's Disease 3. Again, another solid release, but I felt that with this one, Nas was too often using the fact that he's being so prolific right now as the actual subject matter of the lyrics, which just gets a little bit boring after a while. Of course, it has some great highlights. I really love Hood to Hood and how that kind of 80s synth-driven beat is put right next to the 70s style Recession Proof. But I think a flaw in this particular record is that there are just no other featured artists, and that coupled with Nas treading water in terms of the subject matter, as I mentioned a minute ago, this one just feels its length a little at points. Out in 3rd, I'm going to go with the original, King's Disease. The first record in this series came out in the strange summer of 2020. Actually, one of the first records I ever reviewed. Check out the absolutely shocking attempt at redrawing the cover, which you'll see to my right. My reviews at the time were short and sharp. In 2020, I said light and smooth collection from Nas, the opposite of the edgier, darker vibes of 2018's Nasir. While this album isn't as hard-hitting, it's a consistent listen from one of the legends. And I actually gave it 3 stars then, which would translate to a 5 or a 6 by today's standards. Looking back, as I made note of, I did remember being struck by the upbeat approach that seemed so different from the Kanye-produced Nasir, which I really loved at the time. But I have to say I've gone back to this record more. And I'd say it's absolutely at the upper end of 6, if not a 7, easily looking back. There just isn't really a single song that holds this back. In comparison to the records we had to come, though, I think the momentum injected to Nas's career with the Grammy win seemed to allow him to dial up the intensity and vitality in the subsequent entries. And I think Hit Boy would hone in on some of the grittier styles that complemented the rapper better. So that's at number 3. At 2nd, and I might be suffering with some recency bias here, I'm actually going to put Magic 2. I just thought this record was a blast. I've just put out a full review, which I'll link below, so check that out if you're interested. But I think although it's short, it actually addresses all of the flaws I just mentioned with KD3, and obviously just maintains the greatness that runs through the entire series. So yeah, putting that at number 2. So it just leaves us with one left for number 1. And I think, my favorite overall has to be King's Disease 2 that came out in 2021. At the time, this felt like an unusually fast follow-up, but little did we know this was the first of many, with the first Magic literally following a few months later, and 3 the following year after that. I think this record definitely doesn't have the focus of the first entry. It's quite baggy towards the end of the record and even has an outright dud in the form of YKTV, in my opinion. But overall, this album just goes harder than the first, with killer verses throughout and some amazing features. EPMD2 is so much fun for this, with Eminem and EPMD, as well as a rare feature from Lauryn Hill even later in the album, and even better beats than the first. Nas covers a wide variety of topics and even sees him going back through some historic moments in hip-hop history from his perspective, like Death Row East, which also has one of my favourite beats in the set with its guitar sample and retro scratching. This one didn't get the commercial success of the first with like Grammy accolades, etc., but I think it's one of the strongest and most ambitious in this series of album, and I think it deserves a lot of love. It's my number one easily. So there we go, that's the last 5 Nas albums ranked. I'll have to get round to doing a full tier list at some point, but until then, let me know what you think. How would you stack these records? Give us a shout in the comments below. Wholesome Abuse. Don't forget to hit subscribe for more content. Check out some other videos you might like in the description, as well as a Spotify playlist of my favourite tracks from these albums. Cheers!